Hello everyone and welcome. Today's video is going to be a bit different from usual, as I wanted to try focusing on a specific topic when talking about a game, rather than just doing a full review of it like I have done. The game in question that we are going to focus on in this video is the latest entry in the long-running Assassin's Creed series, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, as well as the other entries in the series that share the same open world gameplay formula, Origins and Odyssey, and why this gameplay formula makes this trilogy of games both the best and most refined in the series, yet also unequivocally the worst in terms of its actual enjoyment. How this video will be structured is that first I'll do a brief review of Valhalla itself so that my genuine opinion of the game in its entirety is established. Then I will go into detail on the game's core problems that actively damage the overall enjoyment of the game and why I don't recommend it as a whole. Finally, I will brainstorm a couple potential ideas on how Ubisoft could avoid making the same mistakes with the next Assassin's Creed game, and take what works in Valhalla and Odyssey and Origins and refine it further whilst cutting or altering what doesn't. As always, if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to not miss out on any future content, and comment below if you have any thoughts of your own on the topic discussed in this video. As a disclaimer, for the purposes of this video, I have completed Assassin's Creed Valhalla on PlayStation 5 with 100% completion, including the Platinum Trophy. So let's get into the video. Here's my in-depth look at the issues that plague Assassin's Creed Valhalla and the modern Assassin's Creed formula as a whole, and prevents it from being one of the best modern open world adventure game series out there. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is the latest entry in the long-running Assassin's Creed series published by Ubisoft and developed by Ubisoft Montreal. It's the 12th mainline entry in the series and the third and seemingly final entry in the current ongoing storyline established in Origins, continued within Odyssey and concluded here. The game features a narrative set in the modern era, following the current protagonist Layla Hassan as she attempts to figure out a way to prevent a worldwide apocalypse by venturing into the past and viewing the history of various characters throughout history. In Valhalla, this is through the viewpoint of Eivor, a Viking in 9th century Norway who alongside his or her brother Sigurd leave their homeland after a dispute with their father and Harold Fairhair, heading towards the shores of England, where they soon set up a new home for themselves and the others have followed alongside them. In order to secure their place in England, however, both Eivor and Sigurd were tasked with securing alliances with all of the regions of England, solving various conflicts as they go, whilst also attempting to find and eliminate various members of the Order of the Ancients, a cult that is spread across England that eventually forms the Templars, at the behest of the Hidden Ones, a group of individuals that eventually come to form the Assassins faction. The story as a whole was surprisingly quite engaging, with some great writing and interesting characters both in its modern setting sections and in its 9th century setting sections. Each area of England and Norway has its own mini storyline that somewhat connects to the central storyline of the 9th century portion, and sometimes even to the modern setting sections, though some of them do admittedly feel a bit similar to the point of tedium after a while. For example, the Winchester, Jorvik and London storylines each focus on tracking down Free Order members in each city that are terrorising the locals, only differing in the NPCs you interact with during those stories, but having the same overall formula. I'll get into more detail on the flaws in the story in terms of pacing later on in this video, as it's one of the many factors that filter into the main reason this game is so flawed. But for the most part, I will say the story was definitely my favourite part of the game as a whole. I found the ending quite compelling too, with how it resolves both Eivor's journey and Layla's journey, as well as how it ties the game into the original Assassin's Creed trilogy's modern storyline fairly well as well, connecting the games in the series together a lot better and making it quite exciting to speculate on where the storyline will be going next. The gameplay is quite good as well for the most part, with combat being a slightly more refined version of Odyssey's combat, with light and heavy attacks, blocking, dodging, parrying and counter-attacking as your standard movesets, with various special abilities that can be triggered to cause extra damage or stun an enemy. You also have your bow and arrow with various different bow types that can control slightly differently and use different types of ammunition. Weapons as well, there's tons of different weapons at your disposal, from flails, swords, shields, daggers, axes, lances, and you can equip multiple depending on the weapon. So you can dual wield daggers, or dual wield a short sword and a dagger, short sword and a shield, that sort of thing, which allows for a lot more variety to the overall movesets at your disposal, and allows for a lot of experimentation in what gameplay style fits you personally, which is something I really enjoyed. Stealth is another thing that's available to you here, though in Valhalla it definitely feels like it's tacked on, as sneaking around is almost never an actual viable option due to enemies always being in clusters and their range of vision being way too large, which is a little annoying. The game also utilises a levelling system where you'll get experience from progressing with the story, exploring the open world, collecting collectibles and so on, that will give you skill points that you can allocate on a large grid with a level cap of up to 400. Though once you hit that cap you can still get skill points past that, which you can then allocate in free special nodes that buff certain stats such as damage output or health. The levelling system I'll go into more detail later on though, as this yet again is another small factor that feeds into the larger issues the game has, and it might even be one of the core linchpins holding the game back from greatness, as each area in the game is level gated behind a recommended level, and some of them, such as the final area of Hamtunshire, can be quite ridiculous, requiring you to fully complete about 70% of the game before reaching that level, which for me took about between 80 to 90 hours. I should probably mention that this game is the first Assassin's Creed game on the next generations of game consoles, and both the graphical fidelity and performance of the game was really good for the most part, with the game's HDR implementation in particular looking quite great. Though the game is plagued with quite a few bugs and glitches, and you're pretty much guaranteed to encounter a couple over the course of your time playing the game. The worst glitches were the ones that bugged some of the collectibles in the game, though thankfully I could solve most of those by saving and reloading. I should also mention that I played the game a couple months after launch, after quite a few patches released, so my experience playing it won't have been the same as someone who played the game at launch and encountered more bugs and glitches, and it probably won't be exactly the same as someone playing it a couple months from now when most of the bugs and glitches are ironed out. Interestingly, Assassin's Creed Valhalla doesn't really take advantage of some of the PS5's unique features much, such as the haptic feedback, adaptive triggers or 3D audio that well, which was a little disappointing as I played it after I had played Immortals Phoenix Rising, which was another game published by Ubisoft that shared the same open world format and had some really cool haptic feedback and adaptive trigger usage. The game's soundtrack and voice acting is good too, helping to make the characters likeable and ensuring that the emotional and tense moments of the game's narrative are effective and enjoyable for the right reasons. Admittedly, only one or two pieces of music within the game's soundtrack was particularly memorable for me personally, as a lot of it is kind of forgettable outside of the game, but when you're in the heat of the action you probably won't dislike any of the tracks, and they are all really good what they are, so it's at the very least a serviceable soundtrack. The world of Assassin's Creed Valhalla is fairly well developed for the most part as well, with quite a lot of different locations, predominantly the entirety of 9th century England, as well as parts of Norway and Vinland. You also explore Isu locations such as Asgard and Jotunheim, which are just as big, if not larger, than some of the English territories. Each location has a plethora of different collectibles, mysteries and artifacts to complete, though as I'll mention later, this is probably for the detriment and distracts from enjoying the various different locales. England as well during this time period is probably the most boring locale for an Assassin's Creed game to be set in from an aesthetics point of view, because aside from one or two regions of the country, it all looks the bloody same, with most of it consisting of large open fields or forests or the same sort of hills and rocky ruins. The town and general building designs are fairly lackluster as well, as there are only a handful of unique building designs that are all copied across the country. Despite it all though, I think that most of the game is actually really good, with an interesting and compelling storyline, likeable and fleshed out characters, gorgeous locales, great visuals with mostly solid performance. That being said, I cannot in good mind recommend this game in the slightest, as the problems that the game has in its core design undermines almost all of that. So let's go ahead and discuss that main issue and all of the smaller issues that feed directly into it and how they negatively impact the game. This main issue I'm talking about is the game's incredibly bloated length and the quality of the content that causes that bloat, as well as how the bloat affects a lot of the regular gameplay mechanics and the pacing of the story. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is an absurdly long game. Not even just to 100% complete or anything, but one's journey just to finish the narrative and see the game's ending will take you anywhere from 60 to 90 hours, depending on skill level and difficulty. If for some reason you're like me and you are either filled with an abundance of self-loathing or you just have nothing better to do, and you attempt to go for 100% completion, it took me around 110 hours on the easiest difficulty settings to reach full completion, which entails finishing all main quests, assassinating the entire Order of the Ancients, and collecting everything in every area of the game, whether it be wealth collectibles, mysteries, or artifacts. Quantity is definitely something that is important when paying full price for a video game because you want to get your money's worth, of course. Especially with how much more expensive games are this generation, but in the long run it's not quantity that decides whether a game is impactful or memorable, but rather its quality. I'd rather pay full price for a 20-hour game that is memorable, enjoyable and genuinely great from start to finish, than a game that is 100 hours long with only a fraction of those hours being actually enjoyable. Now I should state that long games aren't inherently a bad thing. A lot of games can be just as long, if not longer than Valhalla to complete, yet are still engaging and entertaining throughout without much complaint, especially multiplayer games or role-playing games. It's just finding the balance of maintaining the quality of the game through the quantity that's important. So the question is now then, why does Assassin's Creed Valhalla in particular fall flat? Well, I should mention that the problems I have with Valhalla apply to its predecessors Origins and Odyssey as well, though those games do have some differences to them that make them better in some aspects but worse in others. The way the current style of Assassin's Creed game design primarily operates is that it places you within an absurdly large open world filled with hundreds of arbitrary collectibles and side activities to complete, as well as a main story to progress through. It's the standard generic open world fare that's plagued game design for over a decade now, so I bet you're wondering, why is the way Valhalla implements it so bad? Well, the core issue is that where in most open world games most of these arduous time wasting activities are optional objectives that don't really intrude with your enjoyment of the main story and can be completed whenever you feel like it, in Valhalla, however, the leveling system that the player and enemy balancing is built on pretty much requires you to actually complete a large portion of this arduous, unfulfilling padding in order to be at a high enough level that you can progress with the story. Each area in the game is level gated by a recommended level for completion that initially starts off fairly unintrusive, with the first couple of areas of England, such as Leicestershire and Grantbridgeshire, requiring fairly low levels to be strong enough to progress through the main questline of those areas. However, the further you get into the game, the more spread out the level gates get, with the final one, Hamptonshire, requiring a level of around 350, only 50 away from the game's level cap. Admittedly, you could possibly be able to get through the story content on the easiest difficulty if you're up to 10 levels below the recommended level for each area, but it would probably feel as if you were playing the game on the hardest difficulty at that level, due to how significantly the leveling system affects damage output, damage taken, and other factors during combat. As for the leveling itself, you'll gain quite a few levels just for progressing with the story, that's a given, but you'll have to dive quite a bit into the game's open world side content over the course of the game if you wish to level up enough to reach those aforementioned level gates. Now, if the side content in the game was enjoyable, this wouldn't be too bad, but a large portion of the game's side content is mind-numbingly dull and feels more like a chore to complete than an actual engaging and interesting experience. For example, the wealth collectibles, which form probably the most of the game's side content, are usually just upgrade materials, and The way these collectibles are found are primarily just by heading to a yellow dot on the map and opening a chest or killing an enemy containing the collectible. Some of these are dotted behind locked doors that require a little more creativity to get past, perhaps shooting an arrow through a window to destroy the barricade keeping the door shut, or pushing an object out of the way of a hole in the wall so you can sneak into the room, open the chest and then leave through the front door. But even then, after a while, with just how many wealth collectibles are in the game, even that gets incredibly dull. Not even a third of the way through the game, just because a lot of these creative moments are repeated throughout the game. There's only so many times you can, shoot an arrow through a window to knock down a barricade before it gets tiring. It's especially dire in the Asgard and Jotunheim areas, as there are about 30 wealth collectibles in each and they have no real tangible use aside from rewarding you with some XP, making them worth even less than the upgrade material collectibles. Sometimes you'll find a couple pieces of armor, but all of the more interesting armor sets, both visually and in terms of stats, are either rewarded through completion of other side content or through the microtransaction store, making the armor you do obtain through wealth chests almost worthless. The artifact collectibles aren't much better either, mostly consisting of either Roman artifacts, saga documents, or flying papers. Admittedly, in terms of variety, they are a lot more interesting than the wealth collectibles, as they do have a lot more theming towards the actual time period of the game itself. Though again, with just how many of them there are in the game, it's hard to really enjoy any of them for very long. The flying papers in particular I found oftentimes annoying because they task you with chasing down a slip of paper, requiring you to run across platforms, leap onto trees until you reach the paper's endpoint. In concept, this is really interesting, this is really fun, as fluid parkour mechanics in games are often really fun and interesting. The reason I found the flying papers so annoying though is that the game's traversal mechanics feel kinda clunky and unintuitive at times, especially when attempting to leap between multiple different platforms quickly. It's a shame because if the traversal gameplay worked better, these would have been some of the more entertaining collectibles to collect for sure, but as is, they're just a bit annoying. Finally, the other category of collectibles is the mysteries, which are an assortment of different minigames and side quests spread out across the areas of the game. This category of side content definitely has the most variety in terms of its content, with activities including cairn building, where you have to stack rocks to reach a certain height, standing stone puzzles where you have to move around an area until you are positioned in a way that you can find a specific pattern in the rocks, fleeting challenges where you have to essentially have a small ye old rap battle against someone, matching their verses with a barb that shuts them down whilst maintaining the rhyme of the conversation. There are also offering altars where you have to donate an amount of a specific item to an altar, though this mystery in particular is incredibly dull and lacks any real substance. There are the Treasures of Britain challenges that tend to be some of the best side content in the game, where you have to dive into a cave or crypt network and use traversal and light puzzle solving slowly to find a tablet hidden within, which once all are collected can be used in a specific spot in one of the later areas in the game to unlock one of the best weapons. There are Fly Agaric challenges where you'll eat some magic mushrooms and hallucinate a puzzle to solve or a set of enemies to defeat. Then you also have mini boss fights in the forms of the legendary animals, Lost Drengers and Daughters of Lerion. Animus anomalies are another type of mystery, and they're personally my least favourite in the game, as they task you with taking control of Layla through an overly long and often frustrating platforming and puzzle solving challenge, whilst teasing more of the Isu lore as you go, though not enough in my opinion to make the arduous task of completing them worth it. Finally, there are the side quests in the form of world events that usually task Eivor with discovering odd happenings in Britain or dealing with the requests of various villagers and characters. Some of these can admittedly get pretty interesting, and some even require some clever ways to solve them, and as a result are probably the most substantial of the content within Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The big problem with almost all of this content is that It's very bare bones in terms of substance, as a lot of the collectibles are only really there to provide some XP and to fill off the absurdly large checklist of side content the game has. Aside from the world event mysteries, everything very much feels like go to the glowing point on the map and collect or complete the collectible that is there, and then move on to the next one. Another issue is that there are just way too many of each collectible type in the game. There are over 700 pieces of side content in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and because of the lack of substance to most of them, as well as the low amount of variety, there's a high chance that you'll grow tired of it all very quickly. It doesn't help that the side content is fairly spread out across all of the overly large open worlds, so that travel time can stack up and make everything a lot more time consuming, especially on previous gen systems like the PS4 and Xbox One, where load times get in the way of things. To compound that further, whilst the game looks beautiful and the environments are lush and full of life, the large open world is very iterative in the sense that most of England looks the same, with most of the forests, fields and hilltops looking fairly indistinguishable from the rest of the country. The towns too lack the same sort of flair and depth that other games in the series had, mostly consisting of a handful of buildings that all have the same style and design, which really starts to drag as you progress through the game, and you don't really look forward to exploring each new area because you know it all just looks the same. I will say not all of the areas in the game are iterative of each other, because all of the areas that aren't in England are really interesting, with Asgard and Jotunheim exploring Norse mythology whilst narratively connecting it to the in-universe lore behind all the different pantheons of the gods that fall under the Isu civilization. Norway is pretty interesting as well, even if it is a lot smaller and condensed than England is, though in this case it works to its favour for the most part because of that. The best location in the game, in my opinion though, is Vinland, which probably handles all of the issues I have with the game in a way that's actually enjoyable and interesting. Narratively, you go to Vinland to hunt a specific order member who headed there, and as such the main scenario of the area is very freeform, only consisting of a quest where you have to figure out where this order member is and assassinate them. Vinland isn't a small place, however, though it is smaller than most of the other areas of the game, so you'll need to head to several camps throughout the area to track down any clues to the order member's location that you can find. There aren't many collectibles in Vinland either, with only one or two of each type of mystery and a handful of wealth collectibles available, which ensures that your time running around Vinland doesn't drag on. What also makes this area compelling is that you're forced to not bring any equipment or weapons with you when you head there, so it makes you rely on stealth a bit more, at least initially until you've acquired the materials needed to barter for weapons and gear from the Iroquois natives that live there. Sadly, none of the other areas in Valhalla come anywhere close to reaching the same enjoyment I had with the Vinland portion of the game, as most of the game is centred around the bland and repetitive setting of England, and even though Asgard and Jotunheim are so different as well, they suffer from the same issues that plague the rest of the game, which is that there is too much mindless, tedious side content in those games. Asgard and Jotunheim are also very vertically built, which means that a lot of the collectibles are hidden in like tall structures that feel like they go on forever. It's a real shame because I really did enjoy the story of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and Eivor grew to be quite the likeable protagonist by the end of it all, and the core combat is alright if it was a 30 to 40 hour game, but the arduous monotony of the downtime between story segments make the game as a whole feel like a real chore to get through. It's kind of like watching a TV show or anime, but after finishing each episode you have to sit for a 2-hour long commercial break to get to the next one. As such, I can safely say that a lot of people are probably going to drop the game before seeing the game's story through the end, because at the end of the day, time is money, and even if there are some really good moments dotted throughout a game's playtime, you don't want to have to sift through hours of monotony to get to the good stuff when you could be playing other games that are more enjoyable more frequently. This can already be proven by checking how many people have actually finished the game, which, as of writing this video, according to the PlayStation Network's built-in trophy stats, only 14.9% of players have earned the As It Was Foretold trophy, which is a trophy awarded when finishing the Prophecy arc, which is for all intents and purposes the questline that concludes the main storyline On top of that, only 13.5% of players have completed the Hamptonshire arc, which acts as the game's epilogue, and only 10.2% of players have eliminated all members of the Order of the Ancients, so there definitely is a large drop-off in player base when it comes to people who actually finish the story. And we got to consider that these stats are as of 3-4 months after the game's launch, so if most people haven't finished the game now, I doubt these stats are going to change much in the future. These problems existed in the previous Assassin's Creed games that utilise this gameplay style as well, specifically Origins and Odyssey, though in slightly different ways that in my opinion make them much more enjoyable experiences as a whole than Valhalla, though still far from perfect, especially in the case of Odyssey. Firstly, Origins is the smallest of the three games in terms of scale, which means that the limited variety of the side content doesn't lose its luster as quickly, and the ancient Egypt locale has a lot more interesting historical landmarks and location designs that make it a somewhat more solid package than Valhalla, though admittedly that last point is mostly down to personal tastes. When it comes to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, however, that's a lot more interesting to discuss in terms of its issues, as they are very similar to the issues that plague Valhalla. Firstly, the game's map is similar in size to Valhalla, though it's difficult to judge which is bigger overall, as Odyssey's map is comprised of a bunch of smaller islands alongside the mainland of ancient Greece. Again, I personally found the locations in Odyssey to be a lot more interesting as a whole, with most of the islands in the game feeling fairly unique, with plenty of different landmarks and larger and more vibrant towns and cities. Admittedly, it still falls into the same pitfalls that Valhalla has, where the side content is mostly mind-numbingly tedious and boring, but with Odyssey it definitely feels like the side quests in particular are a lot stronger in narrative strength, and it felt like you didn't need to do as much of the side content to be leveled enough to continue with the main story, which at least makes it a much more enjoyable experience overall than Valhalla, because it means you don't have to do all of the tedious padding. Whereas with Valhalla it really felt like you had to do tons of it to complete the story. So I've talked for quite a bit about my issues with the modern Assassin's Creed formula, but don't get me wrong, for the most part I think they're great games with enjoyable stories, music and decent enough gameplay. It's just that they're let down completely by the overall world design and pacing. A bigger and longer lasting game doesn't necessarily mean better, and both Valhalla and Odyssey prove that in spades with the low percentage of players that have finished either title. Origins is a bit different and doesn't really suffer the same issues, at least to the same degree, and as the first game in the current Assassin's Creed formula, it can kind of get away with any issues it does have with its world design and pacing, because at the time it released, it was a somewhat fresh and new direction for the series to go in. So let's discuss now where the Assassin's Creed series can go from here in terms of its general world design and balancing, and maybe suggest ways the next entry in the series could learn from the issues of Valhalla and Odyssey and truly capitalise on all the potential the series has, as there is a lot of good stuff in these games, it's just that they're buried underneath so much padding that it makes those good elements feel watered down and not worth the time investment. Firstly, I think the easiest thing to do would be to cut a significant portion of the side content in the next game, as a lot of it really is just pointless, tedious busywork. If you cut the amount of side content in Valhalla in half, for instance, more people would be able to get further into the game before the tedium sets in, and it would be an overall more enjoyable experience, I think. Alternatively, if the developers wish to keep the obnoxious amount of side content in, then perhaps creating more variety to that content would be a good way of mitigating the tedium. One of the primary reasons Valhalla is the most tiring of the Assassin's Creed games is that there isn't enough variety to the content on offer, and honestly a lot of it is just kind of awful anyway. The animus anomalies and the offering altars in particular, with the former being way too time consuming and boring, and the latter barely consisting of little more than an annoyance. Allowing the player to play through the main story without requiring to do any of the side content would also be a good way of ensuring players enjoy their time with the game, though that does mean that they would have to actually develop decent rewards for the players to actually incentivize them to do the side content then, and from what I've seen of Valhalla, all of the interesting gear sets and cosmetic rewards that would otherwise make for cool rewards are locked behind microtransactions in the game's built-in store. The in-game store also sells XP boosts, by the way, which adds a lovely layer of suspicion as to why the game requires you to otherwise do so much of the tedious side content to be leveled enough to proceed with the main scenario. I'd love to just say that they should ditch the in-game microtransaction store altogether, but ballooning AAA budgets probably make it a requirement to completely recoup costs and make a profit. Though again, it could just be a case of corporate greed at its most prominent, as Immortals Fenyx Rising is another open-world Ubisoft title with a much smaller scope, yet still contains a microtransaction store. Speaking of which, my final suggestion for how Ubisoft could make the Assassin's Creed series better would be to integrate a lot of the aspects that worked in the aforementioned Immortals Fenyx Rising. Immortals was an incredibly solid game that, unlike Valhalla, never outstayed its welcome throughout my entire playthrough with it. Immortals admittedly is a much smaller game, with a world about a third of the size of Valhalla, clocking in at around 20 to 25 hours for the main story, and about 50 hours total for a full completion run. However, each area in the game's open world is vastly different in terms of theming, despite incorporating the same overall ancient Greek aesthetic. From vibrant forests, snowy peaks, and giant forges of fire and metal, it all works well to create a world full of colour of life that still feels cohesive. The collectibles and side content in Immortals are also handled a lot better than in Valhalla, with a more puzzle-based approach that requires you to approach each challenge differently, and making full use of the character's more diverse skill set to solve them. Admittedly, there is less variety in the types of side content on offer than in Valhalla, but the amount of depth to the core gameplay style, as well as the implementation of the challenges, allows for a lot more creativity in solving them, and as such are more interesting and enjoyable than all of Valhalla's basic side content. Immortals isn't perfect, however, as it encounters some of the same issues when it comes to the rewards for completing side content, with most of it consisting of simple upgrade materials or very rarely a cosmetic for Fenyx or their bird companion. Of course, this is probably because all the interesting cosmetics and unlocks are restricted behind the game's microtransaction store, which may make Immortals a bit more insidious due to it being aimed more at a younger audience than Valhalla is. I would still say the overall framework of Immortals side content is more interestingly designed and enjoyable than all of Valhalla's side content, so I think it'd be really quite great if they perhaps lifted some of the ideas developed in Immortals and integrated them into whatever the next Assassin's Creed game will be. These are all just suggestions though, but I truly think any of them would do a great deal towards alleviating some of the more tedious and monotonous aspects of the current Assassin's Creed formula. It's difficult to really predict where the Assassin's Creed series will go next, as we're still waiting on the DLC expansions for Valhalla to properly conclude that game's narrative and set up for the next one, but I'm truly hoping that the next game will learn from the mistakes of Odyssey and Valhalla and realise that quantity doesn't necessarily mean quality. A lot of the elements in those games are great, don't get me wrong, and there is a lot to love, such as the fun combat with multiple weapon types to experiment with, as well as the excellent visuals and compelling story and characters. But it's difficult to really enjoy it all when it's bogged down by so much arduous, unenjoyable filler. Especially when a lot of that padding is required to progress with the story to the game's leveling being centered around it. Bigger doesn't mean better. I think I've stated that a lot during this video, and I think Valhalla in particular exemplifies that philosophy perfectly, with its overabundance of recycled assets rearranged throughout the map to create a world that, while large, feels way too similar to justify the large, expansive world. The lack of variety in terms of the side content is the big kicker though. When you've got over 750 pieces of side content, but it's divided between less than 10 types of activity, with most of them just being random chests marked on the map, with fairly uninteresting rewards, the tedium of it all is a lot more pronounced, especially since most of the side content is pretty mindless and uninteresting in its own implementation. Some of it is alright, like the standing stone puzzles and the cairn building puzzles, which fit the theme of Nordic Viking England pretty well, but the rest range from mediocre to awful, and when that's the content you'll be taking part in for most of your playthrough with the game, due to the over-reliance on grinding, it's difficult to enjoy the game as a whole. Personally, if they make no attempt to solve these issues, I honestly don't think I'll be playing the next Assassin's Creed game. As well, there were a lot of things that I personally loved about Valhalla. The parts I loved were few and far between, and there are a ton of other games, some better, some worse, that I'd rather spend my time on. For example, recently, in the same amount of playtime it took me to complete Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I managed to get through the entirety of 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, Katamari Damacy Reroll and Celeste, with about 50 hours left over, and I overall had a much more satisfying experience with them than I did with Valhalla, primarily because I didn't spend 2/3 of my time with them slogging through filler to get to the good stuff. Those games are all cohesive experiences that are enjoyable the entire way through, rather than in bursts, despite all being much shorter in overall length. I guess what I'm trying to say is balancing the quantity with the quality is something that needs to be worked on with the Assassin's Creed series going forward, though it's really difficult to see Ubisoft accepting the flaws of Odyssey and Valhalla and improving on them in the next entry, as there really isn't a financial incentive for them to do so yet. Assassin's Creed at this point is in a very similar spot as a lot of other AAA game franchises like Call of Duty or Pokemon are in, where regardless of the quality of the package, they'll be able to shift millions of copies from just the name alone. So I'm not sure if there's a real incentive for the developers to make any real significant improvements to the series formula at this point. But who knows, if there is a noticeable drop in sales figures between Valhalla and the next one, they'll make more of an effort to improve the series going forward, hopefully. I'll definitely be keeping my eye on the series going forward, as I do really enjoy Assassin's Creed for what it is, and the opportunity to explore a variety of different countries during different time periods is a really cool thing that you don't really see all that often in games. It's probably why Valhalla isn't as interesting to me as the other games in the series, because if there's one time period in gaming that's overdone to death at this point, it's dark middle-age medieval Europe. It's a series I'm quite fond of despite my criticisms, and I truly hope the next couple games in the series shake things up a bit and change some things around, or else I can easily see the series becoming stagnant and unrefined, as is already the case somewhat with Valhalla. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see what the future brings. So yeah, I know this has been a pretty different video from what I usually put out, and I'm sorry for the eclectic release schedule. The whole pandemic thing going on right now has been a right drain on my mental health, and it's made it very hard to focus on being productive, but I'm glad that I've finally managed to get this video out for you all. Hopefully it won't take as long for my next video either, but we'll have to see, as it's a weird time we're living in at the moment and anything could happen. Either way, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it and subscribe to avoid missing out on future content, as well as to support the channel. If you have any thoughts on the topic discussed in this video, or the video itself, be sure to let me know in the comments below as well, as I'm quite interested to see what you all think. Until next time though, this has been Kingdom H, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
Hearken well in Hall of Kings. On ocean steed my words gain wing. All things meet I thought will bring.
Let's sail!
Thine honor sing.
Run up the sail!
Brave men slain, Valkyrie way.